So that's how we got to this point of great success, which of course we turn on almost immediately because of the challenges it represents economically to ourselves. So Dr. Frankenstein fears the monster almost as much as everybody else does. But I'm telling you, one of the big drivers of that shift from longitudinal to latitudinal is the reality emerging, now becoming undeniable, in the energy sphere. Quick argument on the United States. We have always been the #1 source of energy for ourselves. We continue to be. #2 source was North America, our friends. #3 source, he talked a good game. Chavez sent his very dark oil to the U.S. because it blended nicely with our stuff and the logistics just made sense. And now we got Brazil coming online with the pre-salt deposits offshore. #4 great source, West Africa. And by now you should be asking yourself, where's the Middle East in this picture? Middle East has been the 5th biggest source of oil and energy for the United States. Oil about 40% of our economy. So in truth, the Persian Gulf supplies about 3 to 4% of our total energy needs. All this is true before the fracking revolution, which is quintessentially American because of the rule set that says what's under your ground, you own. Very rare in the world, which allows us to experiment, often do bad things, have scandals, pass laws, clean it up. In 2005, back when I'm talking here, 10 years ago, 60% of crude oil imports. Now we're down to about 35%, and the latest U.S. government estimate is we're a net crude oil exporter before 2030. We've been already for quite a while now, several years, a net refined fuels exporter. Huge turnaround. Why this matters? Evolution of fuel mix in major countries. We're going to look at U.S., Europe, and China. It's all about coal through the industrial age. Then you look at the United States, we shift to oil, Second World War. Europe follows us, big surprise. Middle East becomes central in our grand strategic view. But look what happens in just a really short period of time. Sometime in the 2020s, we become led by natural gas, while Europe becomes led by renewables. And it's the Chinese who are depressing their coal and ramping up their oil that are, in truth, becoming responsible for stability in the Middle East. Makes them very uncomfortable when you say that in Beijing, but it's absolutely true. So here, if you remember one image from this entire briefing, this is it. You got your suppliers, you got your buyers. Pretty obvious who's the big buyer over time. It's Asia. Only one player in this system shifts from buyer to seller in this time frame, the United States, North America. That is going to have magnificently large and consistent and pervasive impacts on how we do foreign policy in the future. So where does all that energy go? Well, it goes to East Asia, which is sucking it in from everywhere. Europe draws from traditional sources, Russia, an exporter. You can see where the growth is. It's China, India, the rest. Good news is we're processing this big hump of increase over the next 10 to 15 years. So miraculously, this revolution in tight oil, shale gas in the United States arrives just when the big hump arrives in terms of growth and demand. And we process it with ease. Take that, Hubert's peak oil theory. But Asia, obviously the new global demand center, I've been saying that for 20 years, now it's pretty obvious. But again, serendipitously, two biggest users of energy in the system just so happen to have the two largest reserves in shale gas. Much harder geology for the Chinese. But look at this pattern. 2/3 of the world's global shale reserves in the Trans-Pacific. So we're looking at oil coming down, coal coming down, gas going through the roof. And when this shifts above that, we live in a new era, because behind shale gas comes methane hydrates. And there's virtually unlimited amounts of that. It's just a technological challenge, which will only be put off by the cheapness of natural gas for quite some time. So you want a Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is the future of the global economy, and it's based on natural gas. So here's the weird strategic irony I've been bitching about for about 10 years. The American pivot, pursued, in my mind, largely for political reasons to justify U.S. disengagements from Southwest Asian wars, comes just as China, in a total, natural, responsible stakeholder instinct, starts reaching out towards the great sources of its raw material dependencies. One belt, one road. Makes total sense. They should be doing this. It's natural. It's desirable. My God, are we supposed to take care of it for them forever? And yet, as they do, we find that highly suspicious, even a bit aggressive. So what do? Just when we need somebody to come and relieve us of this burden, the natural, responsible party, we decide to try to hem them in as much as possible in the containment strategy, thus preventing our relief from arriving on the scene. And then we rub our hands together fitfully and say, what's going to happen to the Middle East? This is the state of grand strategic thinking in the United States. It's embarrassing. I'm going to tell you the spheres of influence are basically set. Europe has gone as far east as it can. For years I've been citing this stat. It's basically still there. We're watching it unfold right now. Europe is short 100 million bodies. Middle East, North Africa, long-term, short about 100 million jobs. Okay? Europe doesn't want to change, doesn't want to have that big influx, even as it rapidly ages, but it's coming. Been predicted for decades. It's coming, and it will come in the most pathetic fashion if they try to stop it. And we're watching that unfold right now. But I've been waiting on this story for almost 20 years. I finally saw it in a German newspaper. They said, you know what? This may actually be a good thing to get a whole bunch of young people who are more fertile than us. This may actually work out. So it's all about pain and understanding and waiting for people to catch the drift. Russia's going to dominate Russia, largely because nobody wants Russia. India, surprisingly influential throughout Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia. I mean, when you're on this coast, you can't believe how Mediterranean it is. Middle Eastern it is. When you're on this coast, you can't believe how Asian it is. We don't appreciate that whatsoever. The United States will dominate where it's dominated, but not so much in Europe. China is the dominant player across the rest. We see two overlaps that worry us, and we imagine two Cold Wars that must happen. I'm telling you, neither impresses me as much as the reality of rivalry between the Chinese and the Indians. Rather than focus on the Thucydides trap of one has to take on number two, it's 2 and 3 coming up at the same time that's the real problem. For a variety of reasons, competing over overseas resource dependencies, expanding militaries, the Indian Ocean, which as the Indians like to remind us is called the Indian Ocean, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the two truly responsible parties that we in our infinite wisdom told not to get involved for the first 10 years of our integration effort in Afghanistan, and then finally said, you know what? You guys take over. This is stupid. Southeast Asia, where they combat each other for influence. Tibet, which matters not in terms of insurgency possibilities or national liberation. Interior landlocked states have no chance at this, historically, and there's no sense to it. Why Tibet matters is that it's the headwaters for the major riverine systems that go into South Asia and Southeast Asia. And then the 62 war in the year I was born. Let's focus on overseas resource dependencies because here we can find the most stark realities. Great site, Observatory of Economic Complexity. Here is export destinations for Iran. Asia is red, everybody else is insignificant. The biggest buyers of Iranian oil, China, India, big surprise. We've historically cared about Iran because of its potential, its vast natural gas reserves. Well, the United States is the biggest natural gas producer in the world now. Let's look at Saudi Arabia. Very similar picture, very similar set of usual suspects here. We care about Saudi Arabia because it's immense oil reserves. But we note now that America is the biggest producer of oil in the world. And then, of course, we go to Iraq to get oil for the West. Except it was never going to go to the West. It was overwhelmingly going to go to Asia. Same players, most important. And now we have a system that's tired of playing the role of Leviathan in the region and has sworn it off in its selection of Obama and probably swears it off in its selection of the next president as well. So again, I'm going to argue the changes, all this energy allows for the United States to think more and more about this perspective and forces China and others to think more and more about this latitudinal perspective. In effect, reversing Jared Diamond's notion. That's the big shift. So how climate change pushes us along.